Atlantic Philanthropies is a limited life foundation. Our money will have all been given away by about 2016. So the mission of Atlantic really sets the tone for everything we do. And the mission is to bring about lasting change to improve the lives of the disadvantaged and vulnerable. So the key words there are lasting changes and disadvantaged and vulnerable. So as a result of that, what we've decided was that the best way of achieving our mission was to focus on changing public policy, and that we're going to use advocacy as the means for doing that. So with our focus on disadvantaged and vulnerable, we believe that they have a limited role, have very little voice in changing public policy, in influencing public policy. So we want to be their friend in advocating changes on their behalf. That's why we are firm believers in advocacy. We use it in all our programs, in all of the countries that we operate in. And we feel that's more effective than, say, providing services, which are all very good. And that's the great thing, as I said, about foundation work, is that there's no one way, and there's no right way, there's no wrong way. But we believe that the best way that we can make the best use of the money that that's been given to us is to use advocacy as a means of changing long-term public policy.
I suppose nearly each of you knows about our work. The Bertelsmann Stiftung is an operating foundation, not a grant-giving one. Our mission is rather general. It's simply to foster social and societal change in Germany and Europe primarily. For that reason, I will focus today on our work on the future of the European Union and of European integration. As regards our decision, to do advocacy and to strongly plead in favor of advocacy, this has not been our own decision. It's rather simple why we do so. It's simply our founders' will. Reinhard Mohn was decided not just to give money for external activities, but to try to trigger change by the Bertelsmann Stiftung itself. And what you should also be aware of, obviously, the Bertelsmann Stiftung is a company-related foundation. This is not to say that we promote the commercial interests of the company. Our understanding is, in times of a euro crisis, which might trigger the collapse of the complete European Union project, of the progress we have achieved in the run of European integration, it's not time for modesty, it's time for getting active, and it's time for mobilizing as strong coalitions to preserve what we have as we can get.
Now, what we are is the EU policy arm of the Open Society Foundations. So what we are doing in Brussels, and as a team of us working here, is taking the information, the research, the input from our grantees and from our foundations and programs across the world, and trying to figure out in Brussels where that information can be put, where that input has relevance to the EU policy debate. Now, in terms of Thomas's comment on the modesty approach, the modest approach, I think with OSF and the Open Society Foundations, where our stated aim is to support and protect vibrant and tolerant democracies, I agree, it's not really the time for modesty. And so what we're doing increasingly within Brussels is, on the one hand, we have a role which is reactive both to our partners and our colleagues in other countries and other situations, and to what is going on in the European Union and in the EU institutions. But we also have a role that is proactive, that is taking forward the open society theme to the EU institutions, to the EU actors, and acting on that in collaboration with our partners within our own network, in collaboration with the leadership in various countries.
Well, being a limited life foundation imposes restrictions on you, and you can't look too far advanced because you won't be around So we distinguish between early stage, which is identification of the problem and identification of the solution, and doing research for that. We might do that ourselves, but we don't support organizations that do it. What we get into is in the later stage, once that has been identified, we look for organizations that want to change along the lines that we think are correct. So there's an organization in South Africa called the Treatment Action Campaign. Very strong, very pushy organization that wants to bring retroviral drugs to HIV pregnant women. And it was stopped. So we support that. We've supported them for some time, building up their staff and giving them sufficient funds. Now, there's an angle to this. We don't believe in everything that the Treatment Action Campaign does or says, but we believe in most of it. So the way I look at it is that we support the voice, not the message. So we know in general we agree with the Treatment Action Campaign's work, but we don't agree with everything they do or say. And that's a risk, because you get tainted with, so you're supporting the Treatment Action Campaign in whatever it does. Well, you just have to take the rough with the smooth, because we think it's worthwhile.
I guess for an operative foundation, the position is very different.
Well, at least we support both the voice and the message, I suppose. And the best way of doing it from our point of view is to get the voice that shares our message, basically. I don't think that there is kind of a one-size-fits-all model for doing advocacy. Everything depends on the issue you want to get through. Just to give you a few indications, I suppose, if we talk, for example, about getting through the idea of a European Foundation statute, that's a rather, clear issue, I suppose. We would, frankly speaking, avoid any kind of activities to get too much publicity on that issue, since everything depends in the end on the support the statute gets by the national governments in the council. For that reason, we would from the very beginning approach this issue on one single channel, so to speak. We would try to get in bilateral talks with those folks at the federal government and Länder government level in Germany who are in charge of deciding on the statute to, encourage them to change their position in the council. One approach. Another issue, our Washington office recently presented a model for an international non-profit credit rating agency as kind of a complementary to the big three commercially working rating agencies we have in the United States. And to make that point and to get through this message, we addressed a multitude of different channels. Obviously, we tried to transmit this message by the German and European media that there is a new model we propose. At the same time, we tried to get into talk with particular decision makers here in Brussels to get their support for the idea, and indeed there seems to be a little success as regard these efforts from our side. As regard the new financial market regulations, there is at least partially a reference to this idea. For that reason, my point is no, early-later approach, no one-size-fits-all approach from our perspective, but everything depends on the specific issue you would like to address and you would like to promote.
Thank you. Neil, from a policy hub point of view, how would you distinguish advocacy, if at all, from lobbying?
First of all, it's interesting because various people who do advocacy don't really have a clear definition of what it is, and it's within organizations and between organizations. So as far as we're concerned, it's public interest, policy work, not-for-profit, moving towards an improvement, a societal change. Lobbyists, I mean, within the EU, the lobby register confuses both. They're both put together. So in a way, it is semantics in Brussels because they're all mixed up. But I think there are various interesting topics where you can actually see the advocates pitted against the lobbyists. And that's one in particular that Commissioner Barnier has been involved with, is the extractives industries disclosure legislation that he's been working on. So in that case, he had a large, well-established campaign of advocates, and he also, of course, had the company lobbyists knocking at his door as well. So there you can see the difference and where we're going to.
So self-serving for the lobbyists and
self-serving
public
to
interest first for the advocates.
Yeah. And just, if I can, just to think about EU advocacy as opposed to advocacy, because even within the Open Society Foundations, there's lots of different national advocacy, US advocacy. You know, there are variants, but here in Brussels, the context of Brussels defines how advocacy works, really. And the way we look at it in terms of layers, tactics, and tone, and variations on those. Layers, you can be going for Commissioner Barnier, you could be going for desk officers, MEPs, the media. There are multiple layers you can try to target in Brussels. Tactics is how you mold those different layers together, what you actually do with it. Are you using the kind of stiletto heel approach, which is like slamming the heel into one policy person's, it's a bit aggressive, isn't it? But you know what I mean? Yeah. Or a kind of elephant's foot approach where you're part of a much broader campaign. And the tone of it is actually extremely important in Brussels. You're trying to deal with policy officials who have a very narrow box in which they work. If they have activists, emotional activists coming, banging at their doors, the instinctive reaction is to close their doors. And it's not clear to the extent to which they must keep those doors open, which is really important to note. So if you're taking your message to policymakers here, yes, there's a role for the emotional, the media, doing the broader campaign stuff that helps change the debate, the epistemic community around an issue. But there's also the much more clinical work that has to be done, that is translating that emotional activism into really sharp policy work. And that's the trick really about Brussels, is how you can do that translation. It's difficult.
And what's the specific value added of foundation in this respect? I mean, foundation overall are ill understood, little understood, not necessarily there is no one size fits all, so it's a changing also audience. For the EU policymakers in Brussels, what is the specific value added of foundation to the debate?
It's clear that as you go into any meeting, any discussion on a policy, you're allowed in with, you have to gain the credibility to get through the door. Some foundations, newer foundations, have to work harder at that. Some of the older foundations already have a track record. I think the way foundations work, funding different organizations, funding civil society, enabling them, being a way to bridge the gap between citizens and policymakers, as was described earlier, that's really key here. And it's especially useful in the current context. Lisbon Treaty said this should be done more. We need to bridge the gap between policymakers in Brussels and citizens. And this is what foundations can do.